Here's Biology, third quarter review, part 4. Types of selection. There are 3 types of selection you should be familiar with and be able to describe if given an example. In a normal population, there is a bunch of phenotypes typically present, especially if it's a multifactorial trait. For example, if it's not simply a dominant recessive trait, but there are more than one genes involved, and there are a lot of cases like that, you end up having a mix of phenotypes in a population, which results in a bell curve. Now you have some at the extremes. In this case, we have light colored mouse at the one extreme, and we have dark colored mouse at another extreme. And the average is the ones in between, and they tend to be the most common types in the population for this type of mouse. Now, if we're talking about selection for one extreme or the other, for example, let's say you're in a dark environment, who has the survival advantage? Light colored, medium colored, dark colored. As you might guess, as is no surprise, the darker colored mice would probably survive better, and over time they would become the common type of mouse in that population. When you select for one extreme or the other, that's called directional selection. So here we have the darker colored mouse being selected for until they become the more common type of phenotype in the population because it provides a survival trait. The second type of selection is called diversifying selection. In diversifying selection, we select for the extremes. For example, if we have a population of mice, and in the case of the rock pocket mouse, we have very light-colored environments and very dark-colored environments. The average phenotype or physical appearance of the mouse is not selected for. So in diversifying selection, we're selecting for the extremes, but not for the average. And an example would be the rock pocket mice. The last type of selection is called stabilizing selection, selecting for the average. If the environment favored the average phenotype, and typically it does over time, selecting for those individuals that survive, those become the common phenotypes in the population. And that's providing, especially if it's a stable environment. An example in human populations of stabilizing selection is for birth weight. The very small babies, under 2 or 3 pounds, will probably not survive without medical attention. If it's too big of a kid, it won't fit out the opening and not get outside the mom. So we have a selection for birth weights between 9 and 12 pounds approximately. So what is a species? A species is a population whose members can interbreed, have mate basically, and produce surviving, viable, fertile offspring. Fertile means being able to reproduce themselves. So essentially we're talking about organisms that can reproduce and make babies, and those babies can in turn make their own babies. So how are species created? There's 2 steps. The first step is reproductive isolation. There can't be any gene flow with the source population. And the second step is adaptation. Any adaptations that accumulate as a result of selection for mutations that provide a survival or reproductive advantage are not passed to the source population, and those differences start to accumulate. And at first they can interbreed and produce children, but as more time passes, more differences, and eventually they're not able to reproduce anymore for a variety of different reasons that we're going to go into next. Remember that the small changes as a result of evolution from generation to generation is called microevolution, or generation to generation change of genetics. As a result of microevolution or small changes, the big changes that happen over millions of years can occur. That's called macroevolution. Microevolution, generation to generation change. For example, peppered moths went from light to dark back to light again. Reproductive isolation. There are 5 prezygotic barriers, things that prevent a zygote from forming or a fertilized egg, and 3 postzygotic barriers, only 2 of which you have to know. Now, to maintain reproductive isolation, these are the things that keep species from exchanging genes and becoming the same species. Habitat isolation, we have live close but in different ranges, so those areas, since they're living in different areas, and if they don't live in the same area, they won't reproduce like lions and tigers. Behavioral, we have bird songs and mating rituals that are different that can isolate closely related species of birds. Mechanical isolation is where the sex parts don't fit, so you can't reproduce. Temporal isolation is where the mating times are different, so you don't reproduce. And gametic isolation is a chemical barrier to fertilization, so the zygote never forms. And all these things will prevent 2 species that are pretty closely related from becoming one species. A postzygotic barrier means that a zygote forms, but there's a problem with the zygote, and something happens that keeps those two closely related organisms separate. Reduced hybrid viability means survival, means the offspring die young. So the two close related species can have children, like in the case of some salamanders, but their children die before reaching sexual maturity. We also have another example. Reduced hybrid fertility is another postzygotic barrier. We produce mules from donkeys and horses. However, the mules are sterile, so the donkeys and horses are considered different species. They can't produce viable, fertile offspring. And remember, fertility means having babies. If you're sterile, you can't produce babies. A hybrid is just the offspring of two parents, and reduced means that there's less fertility or no fertility in the case of mules. Don't worry about hybrid breakdown. That's not testable. Here we have reduced hybrid fertility again. Speciation. Remember, we have reproductive, isolation, and then adaptation. Allopatric speciation will not be on the test, so don't worry about it, but it means geographic separation. Adaptive radiation we talked about before. Fruit flies have done the same thing. They've radiated from a central point and adapted to new environments to become the 500 different species of fruit flies that we find on the Hawaiian Islands. Coevolution. Co means together. We have coevolution, which is one organism affecting another organism's evolution. For example, lynxes affect the evolution of bunnies by eating the slower bunnies, selecting for faster bunnies that blend in and can have large snowshoe-type feet for running across the snow. In turn, bunnies select for faster, more vicious lynxes. And how do they do that? Well, if the lynxes don't have the right equipment, if they're too heavy and sink through the snow, or they don't have the big snowshoe pad feet to help them run across the snow, or the other adaptations like speed to catch those bunnies, then they don't survive. So in a way, the bunnies have made the lynxes a more effective predator because the less effective lynxes aren't able to catch the bunnies. They don't pass on their genes, and only the ones that do have the survival equipment, the adaptations, to catch those bunnies are the ones that survive. We also have different examples of coevolution where flower patterns are selected for because they attract bees that like those patterns for some reason. And as a result of those bees being attracted to those flower patterns, especially ultraviolet light patterns, they carry the pollen to another flower, pass on those traits, and that's a survival adaptation for the flower, even though the flower has no awareness of it. All right, there's two ideas on how these traits accumulate and differences accumulate over time. The first one is gradualism. This was originally come up with by Darwin, and basically he thought that we had small changes that accumulate gradually over millions of years. And unfortunately, the fossil record doesn't support that, so that is no longer in vogue. Punctuated equilibrium. This is supported by the fossil record. We have long periods of no change, followed by rapid change and few transitional forms, followed by long periods of stability. So this punctuated equilibrium model basically states that most of the characteristics of a species will come into existence when it first evolves to adapt to a changing environment. And that's why we think there's rapid speciation as a result of environment changes that force a selective pressure to select for things that help an organism survive. All right, fossil record, we already talked about that. And that ends your third quarter review for Honors Biology, Part 4.